let's go through, starting from the title then. It's often a good idea to think about why this title suits this poem. We've got two things in the title that arguably are symbolic. So we've got the sea and then the land. Normally the sea, especially in mythology, is a symbol of chaos or disorder. It's about what we can't tame in the world. So in the Bible, for example, right at the beginning, when the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, the sea is used as a symbol of a kind of primeval chaos. So we're thinking about the sea then, right from the beginning, as a kind of threat. I've forgotten the exact percentage, but what is it? About 3/4 of the planet is covered with water. 70%, yes, about that. And then we don't know a lot of what is actually in the ocean. Something like 90% of the water is unexplored. So even now, with all the scientific discoveries, the sea is still a place of mystery and arguably terror. There's a famous critic, Dr. Johnson. He wrote the first English dictionary, and he said that the reason there's no pastoral poetry, so poetry celebrating the beauty of nature, about the sea, is that the sea is an object of terror. The sea is an object of terror. So in literature, it's got a long history of symbolizing forces that we can't control and are scared of. Freud, actually, I think, even in some of his essays on dream analysis, says that if you're dreaming about the sea, then often it's to do with the fear of the unconscious taking over or swamping you. So the land then is placed in opposition to that. The land is to do with safety and security. Interestingly, the land is normally feminine in mythology, like Mother Earth, whereas the sea is normally masculine, Neptune, Triton. Interestingly, all the Greek words for sea are masculine gender. Now, it might be that this is because traditionally all the hunting, the questing, the voyaging at sea would have been done by men, while women looked after the home and the hearth. You might find that idea offensive, but the facts don't care about your feelings. That traditional division of labour was due to the basic biological differences between men and women. And this isn't strictly relevant to the poem, but I think it's useful mythological knowledge anyway. Just quote now from The Origin of the Gods, a psychoanalytical study of Greek theogonic myth by Caldwell, published by Oxford University Press. The sea would seem to represent not merely abstract masculinity, but specifically male sexuality and procreativity. The sexual significance of the sea is due not only to its location embracing the maternal earth. There may also be some significance in the fact that it is a salty liquid, and as such a representation in nature of the sexual meaning that innumerable folk practices and beliefs attribute to the various liquid secretions of the body: perspiration, tears, saliva, urine, all of which share with semen the qualities of salinity and liquidity. The same unconscious association underlies the English saying that someone is the spit and image of his father. Spit, as in those creation myths where a creator god makes the first humans from the clay formed by earth and spit, female and male symbols respectively, is a seminal symbol, and the fact that a son looks exactly like his father is a proof of the father's seminal potency. And it's quite strange, isn't it? Eats the land at home. It's not what you'd expect. If you're going to give the sea a verb, it probably wouldn't be eats. But if you think about it, it does make sense given what we just said about what the sea traditionally symbolises. It makes it sound predatory or devouring. So the tone of the title establishes a relatively ominous mood or atmosphere. I think the lightsaber's going to get in the way. It is cool, but... Well, you want a lightsaber?
What does it do?
Yeah.
What does it do? It means I can just point to things, because if I just say things, sometimes people can't see where it is. The blue lightsaber. Well, okay, let's see if that one's any better. Right. At home, the sea is in the town, running in and out of the cooking places, collecting the firewood from the hearths and sending it back at night. The sea eats the land at home. Note that the first sentence comprises 5 lines, and we've got 2 parts to it. One is 4 lines long, going from at home to night. And we've got the sea here, and then the predicate is in the town. But then we add in lots of extra details with these participle phrases: running in and out of the cooking places, collecting the firewood from the hearths, and sending it back at night. So running, collecting, sending. The impression here from the list of the 3 participles, running, collecting, sending, is that the sea is busy. There's a kind of build-up of activity. And then the semicolon means that afterwards the sea eats the land at home. This 5th line is a kind of summary of everything that's gone beforehand. So we accumulate activity in detail, and then line 5, the sea eats the land at home. So it's threatening all the things we said from the title we associate with home, like safety, security. So the first phrase here, that it's in the town, is quite jarring and unnerving, isn't it? Think what it means for the sea to be in the town. Yeah, it sounds like a flood, doesn't it? Running in and out of the cooking places, collecting the firewood from the hearths and sending it back at night. So the hearth, because it's to do with fire and food, again, is often called the heart of the home. Think what the hearth or fire would have meant to early man. Fire means survival often, exactly. So the first sentence makes the sea seem like a great threat. It came one day at the dead of night, destroying the cement walls, and carried away the fowls, the cooking pots, and the ladles. The sea eats the land at home. The fact that it comes at the dead of night, we might be able to link to what we said earlier about the title. It seems predatory, as if it's on the attack. Nighttime is a time when you're vulnerable. You can't see very well. So this makes it seem more terrifying. That's also reinforced when we get the fact that it can destroy cement walls. Cement, you might be thinking, is very strong and would give you a powerful barrier against the forces of nature, but the sea can destroy even that. So it seems there's no escape from it. The fowls are the poultry, the food they've got. So they've been robbed by it. Again, this is to do with the hearth and the home. So protection, the walls against nature, and then the food as well, both go. And then we've got the line we had before, the sea eats the land at home, repeated. So line 5 and line 10. Yeah.
When it says fowls, is that like a baby horse?
No, that's, imagine like chickens. Yep. Foals would be a baby horse. Foal.
How do you spell that?
F-O-A-L. So fowl is like poultry, chickens, and a foal would be a baby horse. What do you think the effect of repeating line 5 in line 10 is? And where else do we see it in the poem? Anything similar to that? Line 5 and line 10 are the same. Yeah.
So it like goes on like kind of a non-description sentence, and then at the end it goes, and then it just says the sea is the land at home.
Oh, good. So the way the sentence is arranged is quite similar. So we said before we had 1, 2, 3, 4 lines, and then the 5th one summing it up. Now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 lines, then the 5th one summing it up. Good. So structurally, the way the sentences are arranged is quite similar. It's summative. It is a sad thing to hear the wails and the mourning shouts of the women, calling on all the gods they worship to protect them from the angry sea. So note that this comes after the semicolon, describing how it came in the dead of the night, destroyed the cement walls, took away the food and their cooking utensils as well. So after all that, we're told it is a sad thing to hear the wails. What word could we put instead of wails that is quite close in meaning, but not quite the same? Cries, yep. But what would we lose if we had cries? What is it about wails, the connotations of it? Yeah.
It's like a big animal that lives in the sea.
You're thinking of WHALES. This is wailing as in stricken with grief. Good. So we need to think what the denotation is and then what the connotations are. So we've got wails here, grief stricken, very extreme cries, like in desperation. And then the mourning shouts as well. So mourning here is, it could be over what physical possessions they've lost, the walls, the fowls, cooking utensils, etc. Or it could be that people have died as well. So wails and mourning shouts create a tone of, write it down, lamentation. 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 So this shows the depth of the devastation that the sea has caused. Calling on all the gods they worship to protect them from the angry sea. So the sea here personified as being angry. This might get us thinking about ideas to do with divine wrath or vengeance. Think about the flood in the Bible. So the sea eating the land at home here is becoming like a religious event for them. They need divine assistance to stop it. Calling on all the gods they worship to protect them from the angry sea. Note that it's not just some of the gods, it's all the gods they worship. This shows their desperation. Aku stood outside where her cooking pot stood, with her 2 children shivering from the cold, her hands on her breasts, weeping mournfully. So we've had mourning shouts, and now we've got weeping mournfully as well. Note how that repetition reinforces this atmosphere of pity, desperation, and sadness. It might not seem like much, but the detail that she's standing where her cooking pot stood is important, because we heard before that the sea carried away the fowls and the cooking pots. So it might be that she's run outside and tried to find it or tried to catch it before the sea took it away. But the idea that she's standing in the spot where it used to be makes the reader sympathise because of how important the cooking pot is to her, and now it's gone. So it's a reminder of what she's lost, that she's standing exactly where it used to be. And the 2 children shivering from the cold. Why is cold a relevant detail here? What have they lost? What's the sea taken? Cooking pots, good, and the hearths as well. Remember we said that home is to do with security and safety, and the fire and the hearth is right at the heart of that symbolism. But here, now that's gone, the shivering is to do with the existential threat, the threat to their survival. It doesn't actually take much for people to die of hypothermia. A human being without fire, without shelter, without clothing, it only has to drop below about 21 degrees Celsius for you to die from hypothermia. Humans are basically a tropical species. We can only survive in cold environs when we've got fire, shelter, clothes. So it's dangerous. Shivering from the cold. Dangerous, extreme situation. Her hands on her breasts, weeping mournfully. Her ancestors have neglected her. Her gods have deserted her. It was a cold Sunday morning. The storm was raging. Goats and fowls were struggling in the water, the angry water of the cruel sea. The lapping of the bark water at the shore, and above the sobs and the deep and low moans was the eternal hum of the living sea. What a long sentence. So we've gone all the way from her ancestors have neglected her down to the living sea. So from line 19 to line 27, 8 lines. And I think that means that is the longest sentence in the poem. And a lot of people forget that poems are written in sentences. It's worth commenting on the longest one and the shortest one when you find them. So let's think about why this is the longest sentence. What impact does it have?
9 lines.
There's a 9-line one. Whereabouts is that?
No, this is the 9 line.
9 line. This is the longest one, yeah? Sure? Good. So 9 lines. What we've got is what could be, if we were to punctuate this properly, actually just lots of individual sentences. Her ancestors have neglected her. Should be full stop. Her gods have deserted her. Full stop again. It was a cold Sunday morning. Full stop. The storm was raging. Full stop. Goats and fowls were struggling in the water. Full stop. Actually, no, that one's comma. Goats and fowls were struggling in the water. The angry water of the cruel sea. So all these different independent clauses, if we were writing it as prose, writing a description or a short story, we would have them as either full stops or joined by semicolons. Here though, what I think the listing does is just build up an impression of the devastating effects of the sea. So it's sketching in quite quick brush strokes what the emotional atmosphere of the scene is. So her ancestors have neglected her. This makes her seem abandoned and vulnerable and desperate. Her gods have deserted her. An even stronger statement of the same mood. We've gone from neglected to deserted. If a parent neglects a child, for example, at least they're still there. But deserting a child, that's even more extreme. You're left to fend for yourself. It was a cold Sunday morning. No cold there. We've had the shivering, and we've said that the firewood's gone and the hearth is out. Yeah.
You link, like, Sundays being like a holy day and how it's cold and like all hope that her gods are gone.
Yeah, so certainly Sunday morning from the Christian tradition has got the idea of the Sabbath and the day of rest and the day of worship. I'm not convinced that these gods are Christian gods. So I wouldn't be making the we go to church on Sundays point for this particular poem. But it's certainly something that the Christian reader would be thinking about. The storm was raging. Goats and fowls were struggling in the water. So we've got words here which start to form a group, or we could call it a semantic field. Neglected and deserted. And then we've also got how the goats and fowls were struggling. All these things create an impression of, on the one hand, let's think about this. On the one hand, I would say it's pity in the reader, and then it's disorder, desperation, weakness, perhaps even despair in the town. What's that, sorry?
The group of words.
You can, if you start to see words that have quite similar connotations and meanings, then semantic field. So neglected, deserted, struggling. We also had mournfully. The sea before was personified where? Remind me what line? About halfway through the poem. Angry sea, yep. So now we've got angry water of the cruel sea. Angry water of the cruel sea. So angry's been repeated twice, but would you say that having gone from angry sea to cruel sea is a significant difference? And if so, why? Angry to cruel, which is worse? What's the change in tone, do you think? Yeah.
Angry kind of suggests that something's provoked it, whereas cruel is they're doing it unprovoked or it's worse than what should have happened.
That's a really interesting idea. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. So angry normally is to do with a response to something. So someone does something and it makes you angry. Whereas we don't normally say that someone does something and it makes you cruel. I get what you mean there. So the cruelty is like it's doing it just for the sake of it, not in reaction to anything. So the cruelty makes it sound worse, more malicious or malevolent. But when you see repetition, like angry to angry, it's worth commenting on that. So what cumulative impression does it create? But we also want to watch for subtle changes alongside the repetition. So from angry C to cruel C. Cruel here makes it sound, well, to me anyway, like the human beings and the animals in the town are almost like playthings for the sea, and it's doing it just for its own amusement. The lapping of the bark water at the shore, and above the sobs and the deep and low moans was the eternal hum of the living sea. The sounds of sadness that we had earlier were wails and mourning shouts. Now we've got sobs and deep and low moans. Think about the change in tone between them. So the wails and the mourning shouts sound not only sad but quite energetic. There's a lot of energy going into those noises. You can't really wail quietly or do mourning shouts quietly. But the sobs and the deep and low moans, you could argue that these create an even stronger impression of grief, because it's when someone can't stop crying, can't stop the sadness coming out, but almost hasn't got the energy to wail or shout anymore. So the sobbing and the deep and low moans continue that atmosphere, that mood of grief, except it's quieter now. And the thing that you can hear above them, meaning could argue on the one hand louder than, but also above as in more powerful than, like standing over, was the eternal hum of the living sea. So the sea here, presented as having an eternal hum, seems powerful for that reason. It's never going to stop. And unlike the fowls, for example, and perhaps even some of the villagers, the sea is living. It can cause death, it can cause destruction, waste, devastation, but it is itself eternal and living. Except it's not really alive, is it? So this is another example of the sea being presented with a figurative image. So think about the sense of energy that living conveys here. It has taken away their belongings. Edena has lost the trinkets which were her dowry and her joy. In the sea that eats the land at home, eats the whole land at home. Quite sad, isn't it, that just some trinkets were her dowry and her joy. Trinkets means what? What's the denotation of trinkets? Yeah.
Isn't it like some bracelet which hasn't got much value?
Yeah, so it's normally jewellery but doesn't have to be, and it's something that is precious or interesting but hasn't got much financial value. Sentimental value often, that's it. So the idea that it's just some trinkets that are her dowry and her joy. What's a dowry? Not when you get divorced. Good. So when you get married, traditionally it is the family of the bride giving the new couple a gift to help them on their new married life together. Sometimes it might be lots of money, sometimes it might be cattle. Normally something to help them make a new start in life as a married couple. So for her dowry to just be some trinkets shows that they haven't really got much. And it's her joy. So the idea that even the little that she did have that meant so much to her has been taken by the sea, along with all their other belongings, creates a sense of pity for them. So we sympathise with them because they seem to have lost everything. In line 5, remember, we had the sea eats the land at home, and then the sea eats the land at home in line 10. Now we've got the sea that eats the land at home, line 31, eats the whole land at home, 32. So to the previous lines, 5 and 10, we've added in this word whole land at home. Remember, it's a good idea to start an essay on a poem by quoting an image from the end of the poem. This is because the final lines normally are the climax, and the climax sets the tone for the whole piece. So the idea here is that nothing can escape the sea. It eats the whole land. What's the shortest sentence in the whole poem? Can anyone find shorter than 5 lines? It to home. Shortest sentence. We got the longest.
The storm was
Weeping mournfully is not a sentence.
Yeah, but Aku to mournfully.
Yes.
All right. Okay. So 1, 2, 3, 4. That sounds like it could be the shortest one. Only 4 lines long. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at the end. So let's note then, we've got the longest sentence already. Shortest one, Aku to weeping mournfully. And that is roughly in the middle of the poem as well. And it's also the first time in the poem that we get a specific named individual, Aku. Before that, there's just a group of mourning women. So in the middle of the poem then comes the shortest sentence, and also the first time that a named individual is mentioned. Perhaps this is especially dramatic because it gives us a particular individual's life story. It makes it more concrete, more vivid for us. And the short sentence probably has the power of understatement. This is quite factual and blunt, isn't it? And maybe that makes it more terrible. Aku stood outside where her cooking pot stood. Even the repetition of the verb stood and stood again, it's quite plain. It's got a dignified, understated tone to it. With her 2 children shivering from the cold, her hands on her breasts, weeping mournfully. So I think sometimes less is more. And just mentioning that the children are there shivering and she's holding her hands on her breasts and weeping says all you need to say. This image in the middle of the poem sums up the impact the sea has been having throughout the whole thing. So that's probably why it's in the middle and probably why it's got the dramatic short sentence. It's a good idea as well to spot where sentences either end with the line endings or run over them. Let's skim down the right-hand margin of the poem. And remember, the right-hand margin is what makes a poem a poem. If you took a short story, changed the font size to 96, and the right-hand margin was ruined, nobody would care. It would still be the same story. But if we got this poem and blew the font size up, so it only had 1 word per line, it wouldn't be the same poem anymore. It would be ruined. So the right-hand margin is what makes a poem, and that's why we need to think very carefully about what happens at the right-hand margin, because all of it is a choice by the poet. Let's just mark all the full stops. So we've got 1 at home, we've got 1 at sea, we've got 1 at mournfully, we've got 1 at sea, and then 1 at home. That doesn't mean, though, that all the other lines are run-on lines, because we also have night with a semicolon in line 4. Then we've got home with the semicolon in line 10. And then we've got sea in line 24. Still though, the majority of the lines are run-on lines. Even this odd sentence where grammatically we've just got lots of independent clauses joined with
commas. So if you wrote like this in a description, you'd get marked down for comma splicing. Her ancestors have neglected her. Her gods have deserted her. It was a cold Sunday morning. The storm was raging. If you put commas like that, writing prose, it would be comma splicing. So even these are run on the way it's been written, though. Sometimes the run on sentences probably create the impression of the endless activity and rushing onslaught of the sea. So this one, for example, that opens the poem, running, collecting, sending. This first clause from at home all the way down to and sending it back at night is a bit like a kind of incoming wave from the sea flooding the town. Perhaps that makes it more effective. The juxtaposition is more effective. That then we are slowed down or arrested slightly in line 4, and then the sea eats the land at home afterwards. It's like rush of energy and then pause to consider impact. Same again. Came one day, destroying, carried away. Run on lines, verb, lots of participles. The sentence rolling in like the waters coming into the town. The flashy word for what's going on here is called asyndeton. Write it down. ASYNDETON. 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 So, what's that? So if you look at the lightsaber on the board, we've got starting at her ancestors have neglected her, all the way down to the angry water of the cruel sea, that semicolon. These are all independent clauses that have been joined together without any conjunctions like and. So when you put and in the place of all the commas here, it would be called polysyndeton, so many conjunctions, that's what that means, polysyndeton, many. Asyndeton means without, so without conjunctions. As we said before, I think the effect this creates is of all the cumulative, overwhelming build-up of the negative impacts that the sea has had. So even though they're independent clauses and grammatically they stop at the end of the lines, because they've got commas instead of full stops or semicolons, we still get the idea of a rush of detail, the rush of all the damage that the sea has done in various ways. So it accumulates, and that makes it more powerful. Think which words would be your top 10 from this poem. Which words would be your top 10 and why? We could go with some words like destroying, mourning, angry, weeping, neglected, deserted, raging, struggling, moans. These all help to create the emotional atmosphere of the poem as one of sadness and devastation.
So,
and remember,
would we not get bullet points for a question on this?
No, you wouldn't get bullet points because this is a scene poem. You only get bullet points for the unseen. If you were to divide this into 3 sections, imagining where your bullet points would go, then I would probably go up to Aku. I think the first 14 lines or so just tell you what's happened when the sea has invaded and damaged everything. I think when Aku enters, there's a slight change in tone and we focus on a specific individual rather than just the general impact on the town. And then I would probably go up to around about the lapping of the bark water at the shore. I think the tone changes there when we start to think about the sea in general again, rather than its impact on Aku specifically. So here I think it becomes more symbolic, more general, thinking about the eternal hum of the sea. And we're back to the deep and low moans. This could just be Aku, or it could be the group of women beforehand. And then note that both times there's a kind of emotional climax in the poem we focus on a named person. So Aku in the middle and Edena at the end with the lost trinkets. So this particular moment symbolises the sense of loss. She's lost the trinkets, just like everybody else has lost their cooking pots, their fowls, their hearths, and really has nothing left. This is one way that you could structure an essay on this poem. What we've got here is just the introduction and then the topic sentence for each of the 3 main paragraphs and then the conclusion. Let's just revise why this shows good essay structure technique. The question that I'm imagining I've been asked is explore how the writer makes the sea significant in The Sea Eats the Land at Home. So I want to make sure that I'm focusing on that keyword significant throughout the whole answer. So you can see highlighted in yellow, we've got the stem word of the question, significant, in every single paragraph. Introduction, each main paragraph, and the conclusion as well. So this shows the examiner that we're answering the question that we've been asked. The other thing I've done is I've just followed the structure and development of the poem. I haven't imposed a template where first I look at similes, for example, then I look at rhythm, then I look at sentence structure. It is good to talk about those things, but the best answers tend to follow the structure and development of the passage you've been given, whether it's a poem or a piece of prose. And that's not my idea, that's actually from the examiner's report. They say the best answers tend to follow the structure and development of the passage. They recommend just having a set of linked observations and arguments. So you don't need to have a checklist of technical terms. You're better off just having a few observations, making some links between them, and then roughly following the development of the poem. So just as we would with an unseen poem then, what we're doing is saying, what is our main impression of the sea at the beginning of the poem? That would be bullet point 1 in an unseen, but they don't give you bullet points for the scene poetry because you already know what to say. So it's a bit harder. There's no bullet points, but at least you've seen the poem before. Then we go to the middle of the poem and think, how is that initial impression of the sea developed? And then towards the end, we think, do we end up with a slightly different or deepened impression of the sea as a result of that development? So beginning, middle, and end of poem. The introduction needs to sketch out what your main themes or ideas are going to be. So a good introduction should give an overview of the meaning or message of the poem and also give your personal response, so its impact on you. It can be quite useful to quote from towards the end of the poem because this often gives you a clue about what it is really about. The most important lines usually come towards the end. So here we've got in bold the 3 things we want to talk about for beginning, middle and end of the poem. In The Sea Eats the Land at Home, the writer makes the sea significant by first showing the devastation it causes in the town, then the despairing reaction of the inhabitants, and finally its overwhelming power. So we can see each of these phrases then gets picked up in the topic sentences. So devastation it causes in the town, that will be our first paragraph. The despairing reaction of the inhabitants, that will be our second paragraph. And its overwhelming power will be our third paragraph. So the introduction has worked like a little map for the reader of the journey you're going to take them on in the essay. The reason we have to add in this second sentence, even though we want to keep our introduction very short, so the exam board recommend keep it to about 3 or 4 lines long, is that it's important that we can give some sense of our reading of the poem. So phrases like overall, I got the impression are quite useful for this. Overall, I got the impression of the indifference of nature to human suffering as the sea is indiscriminate, eating the whole land, drowning out everything with its eternal hum. So you'll note that the whole land, that phrase I've quoted, comes from the end of the poem. And I haven't really analysed it yet in the introduction. I don't need to do that. That comes later. But it is a useful way of getting a basic sense of the poem before you begin. So what this introduction has done overall is what the examiner's report describes as giving an overview of the meaning of the whole text, perhaps including a quotation from later in the text to support an overall interpretation. We have to explore meaning, significance, and personal response first, then show how the writer uses language for effect to create that meaning. So we've talked about meaning and significance, and now we're going to analyse quotations showing how they are used to get that meaning across to us. Does anybody have any questions about the layout of that essay template so far? All making sense? Remember, we don't get bullet points, but we have to structure it in a very similar way to how we would if we did get bullet points. So the main thing with these scene poems is you need to know what the main themes are for beginning, middle, and end. Otherwise, you'll be sitting there thinking, I wish I had some bullet points to help me get started. Devastation, despair, and then the overwhelming power of the sea. Quite a neat little trick to help you bring all your paragraphs together and really give a sense of an overall reading of the poem rather than just disconnected points is if you can link back to your previous topic sentence in each topic sentence. So here, devastation is my first topic, and what I've done is I've introduced my next one, the despairing reaction of the inhabitants, by saying there's a link to the devastation. So developing this sense of devastation, that means this paragraph is linked to the previous one. I then bring in my second topic. And then when I have my third topic coming in, the overwhelming power of the sea, I've got paragraph 2 and paragraph 1 in there still. So all my points are working together, and this means I give a clear overall reading or personal response to the whole poem. You can see my conclusion is quite short, and I've structured it around a particular detail from the poem. I've also given an explicit personal response. I don't think you need to sprinkle the first person pronoun all over your essay. You don't need to worry about that, but it is useful just once or twice to use the first person. That way no one can say you haven't given a personal response. But really, what you have to say about your quotations and which ones you choose, that is your personal response ultimately. So overall, for me, the way in which the writer makes the sea most significant is how the trinkets lost in the sea at the end of the poem echo the sea in the town at the beginning. What I've done here is chosen a phrase from the end, and then I've thought about how it reminds me of a detail from the beginning. And I'm trying to think what the effect of that echo is. The juxtaposition of the tiny trinkets symbolising her future and happiness and the enormity and power of the sea evokes strong feelings of sympathy. So the reason this is a good conclusion is that I'm creating a strong final impression on the examiner by showing off my reading skills one last time. I've actually got a point about a quotation, and I say what the technique is and also what the impact on the emotional experience of the reader is. Now, think which sort of conclusion you would be more likely to give extra marks to. One where someone says something like, so overall we can see the writer makes the sea significant in various ways, as I have discussed, including descriptive word choices, similes, and metaphors. Or one like this, where they actually give you a detail that they think somehow sums up the overall mood or atmosphere of the poem, and then show off some reading skills by explaining it. You'd go for the latter one, because at least they're actually giving you a reason to award them some marks for having an insight into the poem. So choose a favourite quotation. It doesn't have to be this one, but think what your reason is for it and tell the examiner. In the examiner's report, the advice on conclusions is that a good answer will conclude with an individual evaluation of how the text achieves its impact on the reader. Normally, the detail you want to talk about is going to come from towards the end of the poem. The examiner's report says that the most revealing and exciting language is likely to come at the end of a selected passage or the close of a poem. So stronger answers always engage with the meaning of the final images, which often strike the defining note. One of the things that people often don't do when writing about poetry is comment on the effect of individual sentence forms. You often get comments like, the poem is in free verse, this gives it a sense of disorder or chaos, or comments like, the poem has rhyme scheme, whatever it might be, and this makes it seem ordered and regular. Both of those comments, although they're good in that they try to engage with the way the poem has been arranged on the page, are too general. They're too vague and they won't really get you many marks because they're not showing much insight into the poem at the level of the texture of the words. So it's always best, if you can, to pick out specific examples, individual examples to comment on in detail. Let's have a look at this sentence. Above the sobs and the deep and low moans was the eternal hum of the living sea. I put a / in there because that is how you show that a new line begins when you are quoting more than one line from a poem. That is very important for us to put in there because we need to talk about the fact that the sentence runs over that line break. The flashy word for that is enjambment, the French word, but run on line means the same thing and it's much easier to spell. So I've just used run on line. The way the words are arranged is slightly out of the ordinary. Normally in English we would have the subject, so the who or what is being described at the beginning of the sentence, and then the verb will come afterwards. So most of you, if you were to write this in a story, would have the eternal hum of the living sea was above the sobs and the deep and low moans. But that isn't what we've got in the poem. Instead, the word order has been changed around. So the subject comes at the end. Above the sobs and the deep and low moans was the eternal hum of the living sea. So this is called inverted syntax. And we need to think of what the effect is. And we can get lots of marks for talking about the arrangement of the words in the sentence. You can have the same words but in a different order and get a different effect. So the inverted syntax emphasizes above by drawing our attention to it at the beginning of the sentence, making the sea significant by conveying its primacy and power. So the fact that we've got above coming at the start means it's thematically important. The idea here is the sea is higher in rank. There's like a hierarchy of noise here, and the sea is dominating all the sad noises and cries of the inhabitants of the village that it's just ruined. Above the sobs and the deep and low moans. We want to try and make more than one point, if we can, about details to show off what the mark scheme calls sensitivity. It also creates, so here's my second point, it also creates tension by delaying the subject until the end, making the reader wonder what might be drowning out the lamentations of the people. So this sense of delaying the subject comes across here. Above the sobs and the deep and low moans was, you made to wait for it, the eternal hum of the living sea. So there's a sense of tension as we're waiting grammatically for the sentence to conclude. That also goes across the line break. So the run on line heightens this tension by creating an extra delay to draw out the suspense. It's important that you talk about the effect of run on lines where possible. In the examiner's report, we read that one of the most valuable and fundamental skills which candidates can be taught is to be able to understand and follow the syntax of sentences and how they work. So you wouldn't need to do this with every sentence, but it's a good idea to choose one and show that you can do it at least once. In addition, the syntax conveys a sense of finality by giving the last word to the C. So remember, the way this has been written, the C comes right at the end of the sentence, not at the beginning as it would with normal arrangement of the words. So the C has the last word literally, but also thematically. Now what I need to do is just zoom in on one word and think about some reasons why it's effective. This is because hum denotes a low, steady, continuous sound, so the C seems merely to carry on undisturbed. It seems smoothly mechanical. So here I'm showing that I know what the word hum means and what difference that makes in the context of the poem. For extra marks, I can give an extra point, but it could also connote through the cognate humdrum, so this means similar word, through the cognate humdrum, that the suffering is routine and commonplace. This makes the bleakness of the image even starker, making the C significant by highlighting its indifference. So I've got the meaning of the word here, and then also one of the connotations that actually, despite all the suffering and devastation the sea has caused, life's just going to carry on. It's got no real sensitivity, doesn't care whatsoever about human suffering. And that makes us pity them all the more, because nature's giving the cries, the shouts, the moaning wails, the cold shoulder. This makes the bleakness of the image even starker. So we're bringing back the word choices and the techniques to the emotional atmosphere of the poem. And I think it's also a good idea to make sure that you really tie all your points to the wording of the question. Right, so this is an example of a paragraph by a student who has some of the basics in place, but has forgotten to take his analysis the extra step or two further that he needs to get higher up the mark scheme. Here we see some understanding of the meaning of the poem and some of its deeper implications, but we're lacking the necessary insight and precision and sensitivity we need to get towards the upper bands. The topic sentence is quite good. Finally, the writer makes the sea significant by showing the despairing reactions of the people living there. The only things I would comment on here are that although he's remembered to refer to the wording of the question, which is a good thing, and he's got a theme for his final paragraph, despairing reactions, we need to make sure that we're writing in a way that puts across a good image of ourselves to the examiner. So here, the reactions of the people living there, grammatically there refers to the sea in this case. That's a little bit clumsy because they don't actually live in the sea. Instead, we're talking about the people living in the village. And despairing is a spelling mistake there. Spelling isn't actually on the mark scheme, but like it or not, you can't help but notice when there are frequent spelling mistakes, and it changes your opinion of the overall quality of the work. So still, check your work for spelling and punctuation errors, even on the literature side of the course, because it's about just making a good impression. The word sob is used repeatedly throughout the poem, although mainly nearer the end. So it is true that the word sob is used. However, it's actually a mistake to say that it's used repeatedly. Sob only occurs once in the whole poem, but you can see why he's got it in mind that it's used repeatedly, because many of the words like wailing shouts or weeping, for example, are similar in terms of connotations to sob. So what he means here is that sob sums up the mood or atmosphere of the poem, because a lot of the noises the people are making, the lamentations, the cries, the shouts, the weeping, are similar in meaning to it. We know it's a word, so you don't need to call it a word. Just quote it, put it in quotation marks, and you can get rid of this. That's just wasted energy, wasted time in the exam. So make sure that you blend your quotations in neatly and skillfully. It should just be sob is used towards the end of the poem. And then we would want to say what the meaning of sob is and what the connotations are. So what is missing here for sob is that he doesn't really tell us why it's effective. The only point he makes about it is that it comes nearer the end and it emits the same message as weeping mournfully. But even then, he doesn't tell us what the message is. So he's quoting without saying why these words in this place matter. The question you have to answer anytime you quote is, why are these words in this order? Why are these words in this order? What would I lose if I cut this word out? So we should be adding in for sob then that it means, what's the best way to put this? Sob would mean the noise made by someone who is stricken with grief, like a convulsive cry. So the idea we need to get is grief, but also the sense of violence. So it's a very powerful expression of sadness or grief. And that gets us thinking about what these people are grieving over. And of course, that is what they've lost, what's been destroyed. So that is how you would then link to weeping mournfully, because sob is to do with grieving over what's been lost, grieving over the devastation the sea has caused, and that is also what they are mourning too. So it might be mourning the loss of the cooking pots, the fowls, the firewood, but also for Adena towards the end, it's the loss of her trinkets, and more broadly speaking, her future and happiness as well, because they symbolise her joy. The poem explains how the sea is the cause of everyone's troubles. This can be seen when it's described as cruel and living. This personification is very effective at making the sea feel like its own character, causing all the hardship in the poem. So this second part of his paragraph, from the poem explains onwards, is better than the first, because here we've got quotations, a technique correctly identified, and then why this is effective. This could be taken a step further by saying, well, what sort of character is the sea conveyed as being? And you could develop the thematic contrast between the home or the land and the sea. So forces of chaos that can't be tamed in nature, that the sea symbolises, and then safety, security, prosperity that the land and the home are associated with. So on one level, it's a poem about how nature is indifferent to human suffering. Remember, that's our overall reading we're trying to advance, and how there's no way you can tame it or resist it. So something about what type of character it is. But I think the idea that the sea is a character in the poem is a good one to develop.